Everyone, thank you for attending our final talk in the Militarism in Asia event series. We are incredibly pleased to welcome actually back Jodi Kim. She's an associate professor of ethnic studies at UC Riverside, and she's an alum. She received her PhD from Berkeley in ethnic studies, and she's the author of a book that probably everyone in this room has read, Ends of Empire, Asian American Critique and the Cold War, published by University of Minnesota Press in its Critical American Studies series in 2010. Her articles have appeared in numerous journals, including American Quarterly, the Journal of Asian American Studies, and Women's Studies Quarterly. And the talk she'll be giving today is one I'm actually really excited about, called Debt, Imperialism, Militarism, and the Necropolitics of the Promise. So please welcome Jodi Kim.
Thank you, Kim, for that generous introduction, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. I'm so pleased to be back. It just occurred to me that I got my degree here almost exactly 10 years ago. So in about a month, I suppose I'll be celebrating my 10-year anniversary of sorts. Thanks as well to the Militarism in Asia Working Group, to Locke, and to Kim again for all of your organizing efforts. I know it's a lot of work, much more than it appears to be on the surface. And thank you for your generous invitation. So let me just get the timer started. For those of you who are fans of PowerPoint, I apologize. The PowerPoint I have is very minimal, just 2 slides. All right, so I will get started. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, one of the Reconstruction amendments passed in the immediate aftermath of the U.S. Civil War, holds juridical significance because it extended citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., regardless of race, guaranteed due process of law, and equal protection of the laws. Citizenship, due process, and equal protection have come to be the hallmarks of U.S. liberal democracy and political modernity. This Constitution, literally in this case, of the rights-bearing subject, is spelled out in Section 1 of the amendment. Yet the rote familiarity of the key terms of this section has come to overshadow what is named in the other sections of the amendment. In the epigraph above, I draw our attention to sections 2 and 4, this is section 2 here, and query how these lesser-known sections of the reified 14th Amendment reveal the very contradictions that make possible citizenship, due process, and equal protection. In section 2 here, Indians not taxed are excluded from the head count of proportional representation because of the nation-to-nation relationship between the U.S. government and Native American tribes. Itself an amendment to Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, this section retains the original Indian exclusion, but does away with the infamous 3/5 compromise. In Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, in Section 4, here, we are told that the U.S. government is obliged to pay its debts unless such debt is incurred, quote, in aid of rebellion or insurrection against the United States, or because of any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave. Following the Civil War, this section served the double function of relieving the U.S. government of having to pay back Confederate war debt and of having to pay Confederate states for the value of their emancipated slaves. Taken together, these sections of the 14th Amendment display at once the apotheosis of liberal democracy, as well as its contradiction and violent conditions of possibility. The exclusion of Indians not taxed, named in Section 2, cannot but reveal the U.S. Constitution as the document of a white settler colony whose frontiers would continue to expand far beyond its mid-19th century borders. Section 4 names the racial chattel slavery that, conjoined with settler colonialism, provided the labor and land in the constitution of an ever-expanding United States of America. In this conjunction, I note the appearance of the figure of debt, particularly U.S. government debt. I begin with the 14th Amendment as an early instantiation of how the U.S. would continue to deploy and manipulate debt as both a literal and figurative economy, as both an arithmetic and grammar in brokering its imperial power. So in my investigation today, I offer some provisional thoughts on how debt becomes a powerful analytic in tracing settler modernity, or what I see as the imbrication of U.S. liberal settler colonialism and, more recently, post-World War II liberal military empire. In this relation, debt curiously emerges in two seemingly opposite or antonymous forms. As a form of imperialism on the one hand, and as a form of freedom, emancipation, or liberation on the other hand. I will focus on the Asia-Pacific as one crucial site where we witness a violent and specifically militarized convergence of these arrangements. I ask, moreover, how debt functions as a necropolitical regime for those impoverished, gender-racial, and colonized nations and subjects whose promissory notes must be fully repaid with interest. How, I ask, has settler modernity been constituted by this usurious necropolitics of the promise, even as it continually confers upon itself the right to evade its own need to promise? If in the 14th Amendment, public debt functions as a narrative of transition in the political and economic maturation of the U.S., we find a parallel narrative of transition in Marx's chapter on so-called primitive accumulation in the last section of Capital Volume 1. He writes that primitive accumulation forms the prehistory of capital, and in his classic case of England, this took the form of enclosure, or the expropriation of the agricultural producer or peasant from the land. Yet elsewhere in the world, Marx writes, quote, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the indigenous population of that continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of blackskins, are all things which characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. End of quote. In other words, settler colonialism, franchise colonialism, and the Atlantic slave trade constitute for Marx the prehistory of capitalism, rather than what Cedric Robinson would describe as the history of racial capitalism. What is particularly interesting, however, in Marx's discussion of primitive accumulation is the appearance of public debt and the U.S. Civil War. He writes, quote, the public debt becomes one of the most powerful levers of primitive accumulation. As with the stroke of an enchanter's wand, it endows unproductive money with the power of creation, and thus turns it into capital without forcing it to expose itself to the troubles and risks inseparable from its employment in industry or even in usury. The national debt has given rise to joint stock companies, to dealings in negotiable effects of all kinds, and to speculation. In a word, it has given rise to stock exchange gambling and the modern bankocracy. End of quote. In terms of the U.S. Civil War, he observes that it has brought in its train a colossal national debt, and with it, a heavy tax burden, the creation of a finance aristocracy of the vilest type, and the granting of immense tracts of public land to speculative companies for the exploitation of railways, mines, etc. End of quote. So even as Marx crafts a schematic narrative of transition from the prehistory of capital to the proper history of capital, by focusing specifically on public debt, he complicates the political and economic teleology that the 14th Amendment juridically formalizes. Political enfranchisement granted in Section 1 of the amendment is attenuated and contradicted by the growth of finance capitalism resulting from Section 4's recognition of the validity of public debt. This, as Marx interrogates on the Jewish question, is the gap between political emancipation and human emancipation. His reference, moreover, to the granting of immense tracts of public land for capitalist speculation lays bare how Section 2's presumption that Native American tribes are sovereign nations is, in essence, a legal formalism that at once abets and elides settler colonialism's theft of native land and the transformation of that land into property. Even as Marx is clearly invested in charting a teleological history of capital, his invocation of public debt generates an interrogation of that presumably linear trajectory. Indeed, we have witnessed how primitive accumulation in the form of national debt, as with the stroke of an enchanter's wand, has given rise to speculative enterprises of all kinds. Primitive accumulation has multiple and overlapping temporalities, in other words. It is thus neither simply the prehistory of capital nor an anachronistic or belated practice appearing in the history of capital. Rather, we might think of primitive accumulation as another name for settler colonialism, or the very ground that continues to make possible capital accumulation. And since the mid-19th century, the growing national debt has played a vital role in this process. The enchanter's wand through which the national debt begets speculative capital has more recently been endowed with an even greater magic. The 14th Amendment recognizes and validates the public debt, and recent debates about the debt ceiling attempted to make urgent the question of the U.S. government's ability to pay back its loans. Still, the U.S. is the greatest debtor nation in the world, and thus far, its debt has been rolled over indefinitely. This is a story of how the U.S. rigged the game of world finance in 1971. It is the story of debt as imperialism, or what economist Michael Hudson calls debt imperialism. And this is the first form of debt that I'm discussing today. The U.S. exercises debt imperialism by virtue of and not despite its status as the greatest debtor in the world. How has the U.S. been able to convert indebtedness, a position of weakness, into a position of relative strength, and indeed into the very basis of the world's monetary and financial system? The primary elements in the cruel magic of this alchemy are gold and paper. In 1971, Nixon floated the dollar, depegging it from the gold standard. Since then, the U.S. has become the world's greatest debtor and has reached a level of indebtedness without world historical precedent. The U.S. replaced the gold standard with a transformed U.S. Treasury bill, a government-issued debt, as an international monetary standard. Essentially, what this has meant since the early 1970s is that foreign banks with a surplus of dollars can no longer exchange them for gold. Rather, the banks must purchase U.S. Treasury bonds, meaning U.S. Treasury debt, thereby extending a continuous loan to the U.S. This, counterintuitively, is the source of US imperial power, an effective debt imperialism through which the US keeps itself afloat by inflating its capital markets and generating growing levels of budget deficits via foreign capital investment. It is a debt apparently without ceiling, precisely because the loan that the world continues to extend to the US has become an integral structural feature of the world economy. That is, US hegemony is significantly leveraged via a debt that is rolled over indefinitely and does not have to be repaid. Given the central role of US global finance in the world economy, a US default on its massive debt would radically destabilize the architecture of racial capitalism. The specter of such a destabilization and attendant fears of apocalyptic risk are in effect exploited as a form of US imperial domination. This loan that the world is continually compelled to extend to the US is essentially a form of tribute. After all, US debt has been significantly incurred via military spending, and it is no coincidence that the US has a strong military presence in its creditor nations like Germany, Japan, and South Korea. Thus far, even the entrance of China, which owns ever-growing amounts of US debt, even the entrance of China has not witnessed a radical destabilization of US debt imperialism thus far. It is no wonder then that US debt imperialism has been described as the greatest ripoff ever achieved. US debt imperialism, in other words, is the economic logic and form of US liberal military empire. Debt imperialism is at once the literal cost and effect of military empire. The public debt of settler colonialism has thus been linked with a more specific debt driven by military spending in the post-World War II era. And settler colonialism conditions this always forgiven debt, or the promise that is made with a wink. Writing in the context of indigenous studies, Scott Morgenson makes the important argument or observation that the biopolitics of settler colonialism and the displacement of native peoples and nations, quote, form a transnational proving ground within settler societies to produce a white settler state for imperial projection abroad, end of quote. That is, the very making and continued remaking of the US as a white settler state provide the literal testing ground or laboratory for biopolitical tactics and technologies that are militarily and geopolitically projected abroad. If debt imperialism is the promise that does not require keeping, this proving ground or stolen land is the promise that does not have to be made at all. Liberal settler colonialism is at once liberal military empire's proving ground, obscured condition of possibility, and imbricated partner in violence. This conjunction is a debt relation linking statecraft and capital. So settler modernity has been made possible through a variety of literal and figurative debt relations. It is a debt regime that functions in multiple ways. On the one hand, it is the debt to Native Americans that is unacknowledged. On the other hand, it continues to produce debt for various populations who are vulnerable to crushing indebtedness. Yet still, the debt regime of settler colonialism provides the collateral for various debtor-creditor schemes. In this way, the debt relation is also a sleight of hand. The historical flow of wealth into Europe and the US has been made possible by the violent theft, plunder, and expropriation of land, resources, labor, and captive human bodies. Indeed, as Frantz Fanon writes, quote, Europe is the literal creation of the Third World. Europe, and by extension, the US. As such, moral reparations are not enough. That is, Europe and the US owe a huge debt to the world that created them. Yet various calls for economic reparations, particularly for slavery, have gone unheeded. Forms of economic and humanitarian aid given to formerly post-colonial nations elide the very reasons why such aid is required in the first place. In essence, a protracted history of colonialism and continued neo-colonial domination. As we know, the afterlife of colonial plunder persists through the neo-colonial policies, for example, of institutions like the IMF and World Bank. We thus see a role reversal in which the actual debtors have transmogrified into creditors and vice versa. It is this sleight of hand quality or the magic of various debt regimes that makes it possible for debt to appear in seemingly autonomous forms as imperialism and also as freedom or emancipation. The Asia Pacific is one crucial site in which these relations of debt, liberal military empire, and settler colonialism converge. An urgent critical task then for Asian American studies is to interrogate that violent convergence. If the sheer pervasiveness of militarization and military violence in the Asia Pacific constitutes what Sasha Davis calls a banal colonialism, then we need to make obvious the brutality of that banality. US militarization in the Asia Pacific, at once brutal and banal, is an ongoing history of violence that continues to press forward into the present and the future. The Obama administration's recent decision to pivot from the Middle East to the Asia Pacific, revealed in then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's October 2011 policy plan, called America's Pacific Century, gives renewed vigor to an already protracted history of violence. In this plan, the Asia Pacific is identified as the most crucial sphere of US influence in the 21st century and the region where US military resources will be concentrated. Yet even in the previous century, the so-called American century, even in the absence of such an explicit pivot, we witnessed a brutal yet banal concentration of military resources and violence. While there is an emergent body of scholarship on Asian settler colonialism in Hawaii that analyzes the position of Asian Americans, especially Japanese Americans, as settlers structurally complicit in the settler colonial project, specifically in Hawaii, what remains to be elaborated further is precisely this nexus of settler colonialism within what became the United States of America and the orders and outposts of liberal military empire in the Asia Pacific. That is, the US as the literal testing ground for biopolitical tactics and technologies that are geopolitically and militarily projected abroad has produced native displacement as the juridical and temporal precedent in some ways for Asian arrival, an arrival that is itself in turn the result of displacements wrought by that geopolitical and military projection abroad in Asia. This necessitates a relational analysis of distinct yet related forms of colonialism, in this instance of liberal settler colonialism and liberal military empire, rather than a focus on one form that tends to elide or erase the other. Indeed, to speak of militarization that produced and continues to produce the US as a white settler state is to speak of a way of life. Militarization exceeds the temporal parameters of war, the spatial demarcations of military bases, the functional ends of military institutions, and the enlistment of military personnel. I'm going to take a swig of water. Militarization, in other words, is all of these things yet more. Eisenhower's warning in his 1961 farewell address about the dangers of a military-industrial complex acquiring unwarranted power turns out to have been prescient and necessary, but ultimately unheeded. Today, a constellation of phenomena, historical processes, and subjectivities can be properly characterized and need to be urgently critiqued as militarized. These include militarized humanitarianism, militarized diaspora, militarized adoption, militarized prostitution, and so forth. What does it mean that the term militarized serves as a proper adjective appearing in a host of modifier noun couplings that at first seem oxymoronic or unlikely, but upon closer critical examination are compatible, co-constitutive, and verging on the tautological? In their important anthology, Militarized Currents Toward a Decolonized Future in Asia and the Pacific, Setsu Shigematsu and Keith Camacho analyzed militarization, quote, as an extension of colonialism and its gendered and racialized processes, interrogating how, quote, colonial histories constitute the conditions of possibility for ongoing forms of militarization, end of quote. Invasion and annexation of Hawaii, territorial acquisition of Guam, genocidal colonial conquest of the Philippines, occupation of Japan and Okinawa, wars in Korea and Vietnam. These have been some of the U.S.'s militarized campaigns in Asia and the Pacific, spanning over a century thus far. Asian and Pacific migration to the U.S. has been significantly constituted by this protracted history of militarized intervention, especially its Cold War phase. As Cynthia Enloe and others have observed, the Pacific Rim is strung together with a necklace of U.S. military bases, violently producing what Enloe calls a militarized interconnectedness. This necessitates intellectual, political, and cultural projects that can take that interconnectedness into critical account while being attentive to local specificities, differences, and hierarchies. To name just a few examples, the history of Japanese empire and militarism in Asia and the Pacific, Asian settler colonialism in Hawaii, and specific developments such as the May 2012 U.S.-Japan agreement to withdraw 9,000 U.S. troops from Okinawa and transfer them to Guam, Hawaii, and Australia, these developments challenge assumptions of a coherent or homogeneous Pacific Rim or Asia-Pacific. Yet to the extent that Asia and the Pacific have been and continue to be strategic sites and staging grounds of U.S. liberal military empire, or the locus of a militarized interconnectedness, they and their futures are enchained. While we can use the terms militarization and militarism somewhat interchangeably, we might also think of militarization as the process that both contributes to and is the effect of militarism. Next, militarism in turn indexes something much more pervasive than the collusion between the military and the arms industry named by Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. We might conceptualize instead regimes of militarism as the colonial and neo-colonial nexus of state and capital that generates a proliferation of military logics beyond formal military institutions and sites, and beyond the war-making, peacekeeping, and security functions of the military itself. Regimes of militarism constitute U.S. liberal military empire, and they pervade the ideological and institutional, the material and discursive, the global and local, and act as a structuring force and logic, not only in international geopolitical relations, but also in the daily and intimate lives of colonized, neo-colonized, and gendered racial subjects. These regimes of militarism come with a high price tag. In other words, they drive U.S. debt imperialism. As I will discuss later, even as these regimes of militarism incur a debt that the U.S. does not need to repay, they install a figurative economy of what we might call militarized indebtedness onto the colonized, onto those who are subjected to such banal colonialism. But now, we return for a moment to the story of US debt imperialism. The US's abandonment of the gold standard in the early 1970s has ushered in a fatal double standard. Even as the US rolls over its debts indefinitely, it imposes structural adjustment policies, austerity measures, and foreclosures on other debtor countries and populations. Variously labeled third world debtors, subprime borrowers, and heavily indebted poor countries, or the HIPCs of sub-Saharan Africa, these debtors are conditioned by the structures of colonialism and race. As such, unlike the US, they cannot have their loans rolled over indefinitely. They are compelled to keep their promises, for failure to do so results in punishment and discipline. I call this debt as governmentality and at times as necropolitics. If, as David Graeber suggests, a debt is just, quote, the perversion of a promise corrupted by both math and violence, end of quote, then who can have their debt rolled over indefinitely, who can have their debts forgiven altogether, and who must fully repay their debts with interest? Within this economy, in other words, who must keep their promises? For those who have been subjected to math and violence, that is, to histories of colonialism, genocide, chattel slavery, and militarism, more recent forms of math and violence include the machinations, as I have mentioned, of neo-colonial institutions like the World Bank and IMF, and an international division not only of gendered racial labor, but also of debt. For these persons and places marked by a debt that, as Denise da Silva and Paula Chakrabarty write, cannot be settled even with death, debt is not simply a perversion of a promise. As I see it, debt in this instance is itself both a relation and instrument of violence, converted by the strange math of liberal military empire, settler modernity, and racial capitalism into a promissory note that binds. Moreover, in the more recent context, the strange math or violent arithmetic of neoliberalism subsumes every aspect of our lives, our everyday life, and indeed of life itself to the logics of financialization. Considering such a relationship between debt and life itself, brings us to the second form of the political life of debt, or the empire of debt under investigation today, and that is freedom or liberation. Let us dwell for a moment with a pithy lyric by Jamaican artist Mutabaruka, who writes and sings of, quote, life and debt, freedom not yet. He captures freedom's antinomies by questioning freedom's content and temporality. To live a life excruciatingly tethered to debt is to live a conjunctional life and debt. In Mutabaruka's formulation, life and debt are one and the same. Debt owns your life, and in doing so, it owns your freedom. By taking residence as the content of formal freedom, debt works in this instance to vacate or evict the substantive meaning of freedom and to forestall the event and temporality of freedom as a not yet. In this sense, we can speak of debt as a receding grammar of life that perpetually diminishes before our horizon into a future tense, a vanishing point through which a not yet freedom is perhaps glimpsed but always foreclosed. Haunting this vanishing point is the term that Mutabaruka self-consciously substitutes debt for, and this is death. A life of debt forecloses an intimacy with freedom, which is to say that it forces an intimacy with forms of social and physical death. Debt, in other words, can be a death sentence, and while some might be able to have their sentences commuted, others experience a fatal present tense flashing blindingly forward. Yet the math and violence of this literal economy of debt as the foreclosure of freedom enjoins us to ask how debt as a figurative economy emerges as the effect of emancipation and liberation. Saidiya Hartman writes that emancipation for the enslaved in the U.S. instituted indebtedness through a calculus of blame and reciprocity or responsibility through which the newly freed were obliged to repay their emancipators' investment of faith and demonstrate their worthiness. This figurative economy of indebtedness, compelling submission and servitude, was conjoined to a literal one in which black laborers were rendered vulnerable to peonage and debt servitude. In this way, the transition from slavery to freedom, writes Hartman, constructed, quote, an already accrued debt, abstinent present, and the mortgaged future. In short, to be free was to be a debtor, that is, obliged and duty-bound to others, end of quote. Yet what of debt when whole nations are also liberated? In this instance, gratitude is infigured as indebtedness through the scripting of military intervention and imperial violence as a bestowal or gift of national liberation. Writing in the context of U.S. imperialism in Asia, Lisa Yonayama argues that, quote, the imperialist myth of liberation and rehabilitation confers belatedness and indebtedness. The newly liberated nation experiences a belatedness vis-a-vis political modernity, yet it must demonstrate again and again an indebtedness to its imperial liberator for making the presumed eventual arrival at political modernity possible in the first place. But in the end, this moment of arrival never quite arrives, so the debt cannot ever be fully repaid. A provisional gift, in other words, installs perpetual debt. In the Asia-Pacific, sites that experience a heavy U.S. military presence, particularly islands such as Guam, are what Sasha Davis calls sacrifice areas for an imperial national security. Even as their lands, lives, and ways of life are thus sacrificed, they are interpolated into an economy of militarized indebtedness. While Hawaii was formally incorporated into the U.S. as a state in 1959, the island of Guam still remains an unincorporated U.S. territory. Militarized indebtedness is poignantly rendered in cultural forms such as Chris Perez Howard's Mariquita, A Tragedy of Guam, a biographical novel that charts his Chamorro mother's coming of age during the U.S. military occupation, marriage to a white American man in the Navy, and premature death at the hands of the Japanese occupiers during World War II. The novel ends with the liberation of Guam by the U.S. military in 1944 and provides a prehistory of a figurative economy of indebtedness to the U.S. military for liberating Guam from centuries of Spanish colonization. Mariquita registers the ambivalence of the indigenous Chamorro population vis-a-vis the omnipresence of the U.S. military. Quote, the streets, not uniformly laid out as in American cities to form symmetrical blocks, posed a geometric puzzle to the naval administrators who governed Guam. Steps were immediately taken to create a military order out of what must have appeared to be exotic chaos, and the military scrutiny extended to all phases of island life. After 40 years, this improbable relationship worked, mainly because the islanders had no alternative and the military desired it. End of quote. So even as the majority of Guamanians enthusiastically supported the Americanization of Guam, the novel displays the contradictions and slippages of that support. What does it mean to support something within a social formation that does not allow alternatives? Mariquita, what Howard's mother Maria was called, gets interviewed by Collier's magazine in 1939 and reveals, quote, the instant school lets out all kids, even of the highest grades, all kids, even of the highest grades, lapse into tomorrow, which is untaught except by word of mouth at home, but has extraordinary vitality. It is in our hearts." End of quote. This extraordinary vitality of the Chamorro language coexists with and attenuates the feeling of indebtedness to the U.S. for its putative gifts of liberation, education, infrastructure, and culture. In the post-liberation or post-World War II context, the relationship between what the U.S. military desires and the desire for the military by Chamorros, a linked set of militarized desires, indexes an ongoing cycle of compelled dependence. The military has become the preeminent site through which such affects, desires, and needs are fulfilled. Indeed, a Chamorro major who teaches in the Reserve Officers Training Corps program at the University of Guam articulates his sense of militarized indebtedness. Quote, "My service is payment for a debt. I was taught since I was young about how we were liberated, and this is the least I can do." End of quote. But if we return to Howard's biographical novel as the prehistory of this indebtedness, we are haunted by the title of its last chapter, Death and Liberation. Marikita's death at the hands of the Japanese immediately precedes the liberation of Guam. The two events are separated by just a few days. This near coevality of death and liberation, their grammatical conjoining in the title of the chapter, suggests how liberation itself is a death-producing event. In the novel's epilogue, Howard writes, quote, "The sadness I feel for those who suffered injustice at the hands of the Japanese is deep, but I do not hate. The wanton bombing of the island by the Americans, especially the city of Agana, which had to be bulldozed to restore any semblance of order, to the extent that the old Spanish bridge now only points to where a river once existed, is to me equally unjust." End of quote. The U.S.'s wanton bombing in the name of liberation would be repeated in other sites during other wars. Marikita's ability to haunt, Marikita as in the narrator's mother as well as the title of the novel, its ability to haunt thus challenges its readers to interrogate what Michael Bivacqua calls the banal ambiguity of Guam's political existence as an unincorporated U.S. territory. The novel challenges us to ask why, as he eloquently puts it, Guam is spectrally indistinct, meaning that whatever specters of colonization or injustice it conjures up, they remain the type that do not haunt. End of quote. The violence of the liberation of Guam is a specter that does not haunt. Militarized indebtedness, this invitation to coevalness, is the violence of a promise made in bad faith. It compels us to imagine an alternative politics of debt. By way of a closing, I would like to note that one provisional name for this politics is revenge. How, you ask, can we take revenge seriously as a politics, and how is it a form of debt? By now, we know that the phrase "paying your debts to society" is a euphemism for incarceration or execution. We can observe that the idea of paying your debts to society or paying for your crimes involves an element of social vengeance, yet that revenge is rewritten as punishment and rehabilitation. Let us consider this word revenge, which is derived from the Latin revindicare, meaning revindicare, which is itself derived from vindicare. Vindicare means to justify, rescue, liberate, or emancipate. So what does it mean to seek revenge? It means to re-liberate yourself. And what does that mean in the contemporary moment? A politics of revenge as re-liberation constitutes a refusal of a debt. For the figurative debt, this politics calls on us to view the debt not as an invitation to coevality or liberal political modernity that we cannot refuse, but as an engulfment into the suffocating embrace of imperial and gender-racial violence. For the liberal debt, or for the literal debt, this politics calls on us to refuse the debt by harnessing the power of a collective default against the bullying threat of U.S. debt imperialism. This is to embrace what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney call the place of bad debt, what they call the debt that cannot be repaid, the debt without creditor, the black debt, the queer debt, the criminal debt, and the student debt. This debt without creditor gestures to an alternative social relation and economy and refuses quid pro quo calculations of reciprocity. Indeed, if debt as a lateral form of reciprocity and obligation is the very thing that makes sociality possible, the debt regimes of liberal military empire and settler colonialism have converted and perverted that sociality into necropolitical social hierarchy. In this sense, to inquire into this conversion is to perform a social autopsy. If the mortuary of the already dead and the living dead is a banal edifice or a specter that does not haunt, then what remains and awaits our embrace are those stubborn refusals. These seemingly antonymous forms of debt, or the deft ability of debt to operate as a sleight of hand, make crushingly clear how debt is not a strict economic relation. It is, after all, also a social relation, disciplinary regime, and perhaps most crucially, a production of subjectivity. The debtor-creditor relationship is governed not simply through the borrowing and lending of money, but is animated and enforced by an already existing asymmetry in power relations. As such, debt indexes not only the state and sum of money owed, but a broader social relation structured by violent disciplinary protocols, compelling the indebted, whether at the scale of the nation or the individual, to conduct themselves in a manner that will maximize the likelihood of repayment. In this sense, to be indebted is not simply to owe money. It is to inhabit a subjectivity that robs one of the possibility of having multiple futures, multiple ways of conducting oneself and being in the world. This, then, is the relationship between debt and time. Debt collapses time so that it conforms to the homogeneous time of repayment. As I hope is clear, the colonial and capitalist nexus of race, gender, and sexuality distributes debt unevenly. Some promises demand repayment more than others, and some must conform to the homogeneous time of repayment more than others. The distribution of the vulnerability to debt and the ways it is lived, felt, and embodied remain uneven. Indeed, whole nations and populations of the world have been saddled with permanent debt and cannot liberate themselves from this debt bind. This is what I have referred to as the necropolitics of the promise. To promise and to be promised can mean radically different things depending on where the debtor, whether a nation or an individual, is located within asymmetries of power that are at once shifting and enduring. I conclude then with this question. If U.S. debt imperialism and settler modernity continue to drive economies of dispossession and crises of accumulation through regimes of debt, the question is not necessarily one of debt forgiveness, but of the abolition of the debt relation altogether. Thank you.